Hey everyone! So in my last video I talked about how my experiences with child sexual abuse and the violent criminal justice system led me to be a prison abolitionist. In this video I want to go into more depth about my whole experience with the criminal justice system, from the moment that I reported to all my experiences with the police, to the questions that they asked, to what happened when I was in the courtroom, and the whole process basically from start to finish. This video is mainly intended for people who have experienced sexual violence, who want to gain a better understanding of what would happen if they were to go to the police. It's not my intention to convince anyone to go to the police or not go to the police. I don't know your circumstances. It's not my place in any way to give advice, and my experiences all happened within England, so it might differ completely depending on what country that you're from. I just know that I would have found a video like this incredibly helpful before I had gone to the police, because I had absolutely no idea what the process would look like. So I'm hoping that this video can be helpful to some of you. Anyone who's usually here for more political or social commentary, I've got a video that's scheduled to upload next week that is much more hopeful, about radical hope and optimism and imagination, that will be a little lighter and less depressing than the last two topics have been. And I've also uploaded a video for Patreons only that is about what I've learned from therapy, about the mindfuck of healing from trauma and abuse. I made that video because a lot of people were asking how I coped with child sexual abuse and healing from trauma and the PTSD that came from the criminal justice system. And I made it for Patreons because the videos that I upload to Patreon are the videos that I find that are too personal for me to feel comfortable to share them on YouTube. And I'm hoping to make at least one video a month for Patrons from now on. So yeah, check out my Patreon if you haven't already. So to start off with, I went to the police when I was 20 after it had been gnawing at me for a really long time, and the reason I finally made the decision essentially came down to a few factors. Firstly, I was dating a really toxic man at that time, and the fact that he made me feel really unsafe and triggered me a lot forced me to confront where all these feelings were coming from and what constantly caused me to end up in toxic relationships, replicating the same power dynamics I'd experienced as a child. And another reason why I went to the police at that time is because I found out that this man who had abused me had recently had a child with another woman. And at that point, I realized that I had to go to the police no matter how afraid I was, because I was incredibly afraid that he would end my life. I was afraid of what harm he would do to me if I went to the police. But the thought of him hurting this child he had just had with another woman was so disturbing that I essentially felt like I had no other choice, and I decided to go to the police. And there are so many reasons it took me up to the age of 20 to go to the police that I'm not going to go into now, but anyone who has experienced this kind of violence will understand the depths of grooming and manipulation that can occur, the threats that occur that make it so incredibly difficult to go to the police. Not to mention the fact that the whole system, the way the criminal justice system is set up, makes it incredibly difficult for anyone to come forward. I talked about that a lot more in my previous video, but all of that is just to say I went to the police when I was 20. The first thing I did actually before I called up the police was I spoke to the ex-wife of the man who abused me. I wanted to speak to her to ask her if she would give evidence on my behalf. Luckily, she ended up being really nice about it and saying that she would give evidence on my behalf. So I called up the police, and there was this overly happy man on the other end of the phone, acting really cheerful despite the fact that everything I was saying was quite disturbing. But luckily he took everything seriously, and just I think 1 or 2 days later a policewoman actually came directly to my house. I was given the option to meet her somewhere else. She didn't have to come to my house, but that's how it ended up happening. And she essentially interviewed me, asked me lots of different questions about exactly what happened to me. She was really nice actually, and she immediately believed everything that I said and took it very seriously, which I really appreciated. The initial questions, I think, were essentially just a play-by-play of everything that happened to me. After that, a few days later, she and another policeman came to my house, and this time they had a recording device, a camera, microphone, everything, and they were going to film me as I relayed all the information about exactly what happened to me. And this time it was much more disturbing for me than the first time, where the policewoman had asked me a lot of questions, because the policeman was not as great, to be honest. I didn't like him at all. He was just really arrogant. I felt like he was very unprofessional. I also felt really frustrated because I gave them for evidence my personal diary, which included information about what this man had done to me, and this policeman was just flicking through my diary, reading bits and bobs that I had written in there, and that was really horrible for me to witness, because obviously no one wants anyone to read their personal diary, let alone this policeman right in front of you whilst you're sitting there awkwardly watching him read about your life. It's just, I don't know, some of the stuff that I've written in there I just don't want people to read. So I got frustrated about that, and then they just turned on the camera and they began to ask me questions. Again, it was the same thing, a play-by-play of everything that this man had done to me. They wanted real exact details about all the precise mechanics and logistics of his body in relation to mine. They wanted to know where was the angle of his penis, what pressure was his penis, where was I standing. They got me to draw the rooms that we were in. They got me to draw how we moved around in the rooms, where I was at first, where was he. I think they asked what we were wearing. They asked a lot about the dates and times of each incident and what time difference there was between one incident and another. And then they asked about who else knew about what happened. And this was the bit that I had no clue about before, which was the type of evidence that they would use in the court case. And they ended up using my diary entries. They also asked me to provide screenshots of messages that I had between my friends and I, where I had referenced the events happening to me. They also asked me to give them the details of the people that I had told about what happened to me, so friends or any family members, and then they contacted them and interviewed them and asked them for information about what I had told them, and that would also be part of the evidence. They also asked for permission to access my social media accounts, which I didn't understand at all, because I didn't understand how what I was doing on my social media account in the last few years was relevant to what happened to me when I was an 8, 9, 10-year-old child, when I didn't have any social media. They also asked me to speak to relevant people who may have also been harmed by this man that I knew that I was friends with, or that might be able to provide any kind of evidence for me on my behalf. So as a result, I had to talk to people about what happened to me who I otherwise would never have wanted to disclose this information to. And that was one of the hardest parts for me, because I'd spent years not telling anyone about what happened to me, and suddenly you have to tell all these other people about what happened to you, just in case they can provide some kind of information or evidence on your behalf. And then obviously information spreads really fast, and then more people know, and then you have to deal with all of these people victim blaming you, giving you their unwanted opinions, and just all of the stuff that people say who have no idea about what the experience of this kind of abuse is like. And I'm going to talk more later on about exactly what people were saying to me, but for now I just wanted to mention just that was one of the most frustrating parts of the process of giving evidence. In hindsight, I do wonder if it would have been possible, I guess, for me to say no, I don't want these people involved, but at that time I was 20, I was naive, I was just sort of going along with whatever the police had said that they wanted from me. Another really big frustration for me was just how much crucial evidence was overlooked throughout the whole court process. And one of the most important things for me was the fact that my best friend had also been abused by the same man But as I mentioned in my last video, he passed away, so he was no longer alive to be able to give evidence. And I was frustrated that they decided to completely exclude him from the whole court process because he couldn't give evidence on his own behalf. This was really painful for me because, of course, you want to see that the police are taking seriously the things that happened to your best friend, and you want to see that some sort of justice is being given. And this makes certain people far more susceptible to abuse because perpetrators will deliberately seek out people who are vulnerable to dying young because they know that it will either never go to court, or by the time it goes to court, the evidence will be destroyed because this person will be dead. So after the second time, when they came to record me and ask me all these questions and get different forms of evidence from me, I had a few phone calls with them and had to fill out different paperwork after they left. But aside from that, I never really heard from them for the next 2 years until it ended up going to court. So the perpetrator was called in for questioning. He denied everything. He was given the option to plead guilty multiple times, and he continuously denied everything throughout the whole entire process. During the 2-year process from when I reported to when it went to court, they also managed to find a few other victims that were also abused by this same man. I had no idea who they were. They never told me their names. I just knew that they had been abused by this man before I was abused. So it was more historical abuse, and they were older than I was from what I know. Throughout the whole process, I felt like there was just a complete lack of information and communication from the police, and I didn't really know what was going on a lot of the time. A week after I initially went to the police, I was fortunate enough to have received a scholarship to go to study abroad for a year. I was only abroad 1 year, so the second year, whilst I was still waiting to hear whether it would go to court, I was back in England. And this year was much more difficult for me because I was incredibly afraid of this man during this time. There wasn't much emphasis on my safety aside from one restraining order. I developed this thing where anytime that I saw a man that even remotely looked like him, I would get really panicky. I would tense up. I would be sure that it was him. I would almost have a panic attack, and the court date kept being pushed back. So anytime that I had hope that it would soon all be over, it would then move back another few months and then another few months. So it was just incredibly stressful for a very long time. I was also concerned for my family and their safety. And in hindsight, you know, a lot of this I can look back and think, okay, perhaps this was irrational because what was he realistically going to do? But at the same time, if you've been manipulated and groomed and threatened, of course, a lot of these things are going to come up. So when I was eventually given a definitive court date for when it was definitely going to court, I was once again really frustrated because I was given no information about what was going to happen in court, how it was going to work, what type of questions they would ask me, how I should prepare. Nothing. I felt completely alone in the whole process, and of course I had no decision making over what was going to happen, what justice would look like for me, what I wanted. I know that there was a sort of victim liaison thing that I could have got more in contact with, and maybe they could have been helpful, but the few times that I spoke to her on the phone, I didn't think it was all that useful. They did give me the option to be able to visit the courtroom a few days before I was going to court to be able to see what it was like, but I opted out of that. The day before I went to court, the policewoman came to my house and she gave me the video recording they had taken of me 2 years previously, where I had told them everything that had happened to me. And the purpose of giving me this recording to watch was to kind of spark my memory about what I had told them 2 years previously, so that when I was in the courtroom being questioned, I could give accurate information that seemed very similar to my initial disclosure on this video recording, because this video was going to be played in front of the whole courtroom prior to me being questioned. And watching this was just really cringeworthy, honestly, because I seemed just really naive and did see in the video, I kept smiling and laughing whilst I was giving all this information, which made me seem very unbelievable. The policewoman even made a comment that sounded a bit like, "You're not really acting like a abuse victim would act," which really frustrated me because obviously people act differently in different situations, and a lot of people, if you're neurodivergent or if you have a disability, all these factors play into how you're going to respond in these kind of situations. And my coping mechanism has always been to kind of smile and laugh whenever I'm feeling awkward or afraid. It really irritates me that you feel like you have to conform to this traditional image of what everyone believes a victim of sexual violence would be. They have to be weak and vulnerable and crying and in constant distress. And if you don't fit that image, then a lot of the time you're not believed. So I was also a bit concerned about the video and how I came across, which didn't really help with my confidence about going to court the very next day. But regardless, I went to the court the next day. When I arrived in court, they took me to a room that was meant for victims, and the perpetrator was supposed to be in another room, so I'd never have to see him. But then I walked through the hallway and I had to pass him sitting down, looking directly in my face. And this was incredibly difficult because I felt like he was really trying to manipulate me in the way that he was looking at me. He looked really sad. He looked like he was trying to get sympathy from me, which was a manipulation tactic that he'd often used when I was a child, trying to make himself out to be the victim, the one that was being harmed. Honestly, this image of his face will haunt me for a very long time, and there's nothing worse than having to see your abuser again. When they took me into the courtroom, I walked in first, and then the perpetrator and the jury and all the other people walked in after me. The reason they did this was to make sure that I wouldn't have to directly look at the perpetrator, but obviously by that point it was too late because I had seen him in the hallway, and I really felt like the whole way that the whole system was set up was just really terrible for the victim, because as a victim you have to relay in excruciating detail every minute thing that this man had done to you whilst he's sitting right there next to you, which it's hard enough to tell people that you love and trust, let alone telling a room full of strangers and the actual abuser. So I felt like it was just really difficult and unnecessary the whole way in which it was set up. They did give me the option to be able to give all of my evidence over Skype, but I was heavily encouraged to actually go into the courtroom because they said that the jury and the judge were much more likely to believe me and take me seriously if I were actually in that room with all of them present. At this point, the barrister proceeded to ask me all the questions he wanted to ask, and his whole job is to completely discredit everything that I said. He was trying to challenge the plausibility and the credibility of everything that I was saying, and honestly, I just thought he was a complete arsehole. I didn't like him at all. The way he was asking me questions, how aggressive and manipulating he was, how domineering he was, everything just made me extremely uncomfortable, which obviously was his job, but I felt like he could have been nicer about it, surely. But obviously I was a bit naive, I suppose. But the first thing that he did was he pulled up an image of one of the rooms that I had been in with the abuser, and he asked me to show where I had been in that room, where I had been abused, how we moved around. And there's nothing worse than having to see a room where you were abused in again. It just immediately transported me to that time. It made me incredibly distressed and upset because it was a room that I obviously never wanted to think about, never wanted to go back into. So to have him pull that up in front of everyone just felt really unnecessary. And then I found it really difficult to try and describe where we had moved from one place to another. Then he asked me all these questions about what dates, what thing had happened, but he said it in such confusing language that I kept getting confused about what he was talking about. Instead of saying this happened when you were 8 years old, he said this happened in 1999 or this happened in 2002, and then obviously most people don't think in terms of the actual date of the year. You normally think, oh, I was this age or that age, and then you're just trying to calculate in my mind, and obviously you don't remember the exact times and dates and what happened when, so it was just really confusing the whole time. Once again, he then asked me for a complete play-by-play of absolutely everything that happened with this man. He asked me a lot of details about how long his penis was in certain places, and how did he move his hands, and how did you know it was his penis and not something else, and what were you wearing? And then he was really being patronizing, reading out my initial statement and telling me how much I was stuttering and how much that meant that I didn't really know what I was talking about. He literally said that you're embellishing the truth, you're lying, which I didn't even know that they were allowed to do in that way. Then he asked me about when I'd learned to swim, as if he were implying that surely you could have swum away from this man when you were in the swimming pool. He then asked me if what I was wearing was a swimming costume or a bikini, and what I thought the differences were between one and the other. And then he said that the credibility of my story was diminished because apparently at one point I said I was wearing a swimming pool in the swimming pool, and at other time I said I was wearing a bikini, and he said that meant I was lying because the way that his hand moved meant that I couldn't have been wearing a swimming pool. Honestly, I don't know what he was trying to say. It just felt really strange to be focusing on what I was wearing when I was a literal child. One of the hardest things for me to have to grapple with whilst I've been trying to cope with different forms of abuse is constantly feeling like my experiences are not that bad, constantly invalidating and minimizing everything that happened to me. Actually, I'd highly recommend the book Not That Bad by Roxane Gay for anyone who's feeling this way, because it really helped me. But I really felt like this minimization and invalidation of my experiences was really reinforced through the court process, through the way in which there was such a hyper focus on the exact mechanics and logistics of what this man had done to me. It was just a hyper focus on the exact events rather than how it impacted my life and how it made me feel, or any of the trauma and abuse that I experienced by this man that had nothing to do with the exact sexual acts. For years after the court experience, it made me incredibly numb to other forms of sexual violence that I experienced, because I felt like if this wasn't even taken seriously by the court, then surely a man in a van trying to get me to have sex with him isn't a big deal. Surely a man coming into my tent at night whilst I'm camping isn't a big deal. Surely my ex-boyfriend raping me isn't a big deal. It essentially desensitized me to a lot of other forms of sexual violence, and I think culturally we are incredibly desensitized to sexual violence. The amount of times I'm with friends and they don't want to call what is rape, and they don't want to say that what happened to them was bad because they feel like other people have it worse. And I think a lot of it is also down to media sensationalism, where only the absolute most extreme forms of violence are reported on, so we always feel like comparatively we don't have it so bad. And a lot of time I think that this leads to this sort of egoic competition amongst people who have experienced violence, because we're all trying to outcompete each other about whose violence was worse, just so that we can feel some semblance of validation for the experiences that we've had. And I also got really annoyed at another point because I was trying to express what had happened to me in the courtroom, and the barrister mistook what I said, and he said, "You said he flicked your vagina," and I said, "No, I didn't say that." And then it became this ridiculous thing of, "You said this," and I'm like, "I didn't say that." And then we were arguing about that, and at that point even the judge stepped in and said, "You're being ridiculous," to the barrister, because the way he was trying to twist every single one of my words and trying to make out I had said something that I didn't constantly was just disturbing, honestly. The barrister also read out statements that my friends had made in order to try and discredit what I had said. He kept mentioning, one of your friends said that you had told her that he did this to you, but the other friend said something different, so you must be lying. I felt like I was the one being put on trial because 90% of the questions that were asked to me were from the barrister who was on the side of the perpetrator, and the prosecutor, who was supposed to be on my side, only asked me, I think, 3 questions, and most of those questions were very basic. I don't even remember what he asked me. I didn't even think it was that relevant to the case. So it felt unjustly weighted in favor of the perpetrator rather than me, and the whole thing just makes me doubt my own reality to such a great extent, because if you're constantly having someone manipulating you and taking all of your words the wrong way, you start to doubt yourself. And since then I've had additional memories come up, but I'm so unsure whether to trust these memories. Are they even memories? Are they just figments of my imagination? And I think a lot of me doubting myself and being unsure of these memories, these thoughts that have come up, is a result of the fact that the barrister made me doubt my own reality to such a great extent and kept reinforcing that I was a liar, that now I have that so deeply ingrained in my psyche that I can't even trust myself and my own memories anymore. And I think that's just really, really sad. I've also been really frustrated because one of the hardest things for me to deal with has been the guilt and the shame and the self-blame for all the abuse that I experienced, and feeling like I should have come to the police sooner, feeling like I could have prevented it, feeling like I am at fault for all the people that were abused by the same man. And then to have all this victim blaming from the barrister, making you feel like you should have said something sooner, making you feel like I could have done something to prevent what happened to me, just ends up reinforcing all that blame and shame and all that guilt that I felt. And I think that's such an intense form of violence to inflict on a victim. In the UK, we have a criminal justice system that is based on the jury being members of the public, completely randomly chosen, I believe. And I think this is good in some ways because it means that it's not elitist. It means that it allows for less corruption. I believe in the US there's a lot more corruption where the jury is bought out. But I also felt like because the jury had no prior knowledge to how this form of violence works, I felt like a lot of their preconceived notions and a lot of myths around sexual violence meant that they were more likely to disbelieve me. They don't know that trauma distorts memory, and that's why some of my memories may have been inconsistent. They don't understand that stranger danger is a myth, and the majority of people that abuse people are people that you know, so they may have been more likely to disbelieve me on that basis. They also didn't have any knowledge about disassociation and how when I was being abused I wasn't in my body, I was above my body, which made it more difficult for me to remember the exact details of what happened because I wasn't really in my body experiencing it. I also felt like they didn't fully understand the fact that this man had abused someone with a disability was quite significant in the case because they're more vulnerable to abuse for multiple reasons. So all of that is just to say that I think that the fact that the jury had no background knowledge on any of this stuff made it more difficult for them to believe the victims in this case, which is one of the downsides of having a jury that are just random members of the general public. Altogether, me being questioned took about 1 hour to 1.5 hours, and I didn't have any friends or family in the courtroom with me because it wasn't allowed. And ultimately I left. They said I might be called in for questioning again, but that never ended up happening. They said they were going to interview all of my friends who had given witness statements on my behalf the very next day, but after I was interviewed, the judge decided that wasn't actually necessary. I have no idea why. So that didn't end up happening, which I'm so grateful for because that was causing me a great deal of stress, because Some friends were saying they didn't want to go to give evidence on my behalf. I was also really stressed at what the barrister could potentially bring up in court to all of my friends. I also just didn't like that the whole time the barrister had access to my personal diary, and obviously there's so much information in that personal diary about my personal life that I don't want the barrister to ever see. And I should mention that I think for anyone who's potentially considering reporting, a lot of this evidence isn't actually necessary. I think you can opt out from giving evidence like personal diaries. I don't think you have to give evidence like your social media and things like that. And I don't know if you have to give witness statements from your friends and things like that. So if you're concerned about that, I don't think that is a necessity, because I think you always are the one to give the consent to say that that is okay. I just did all of these things because I really wanted it to potentially go to court, and I wanted to do everything to ensure that it would. So after the 2-week court process was over, in which time they questioned all the other victims and the abuser, they decided that he would be found guilty on every single count. And at that time, the policewoman came to my home and she asked me to give a witness statement, or a victim statement, I should say, of how this abuser had impacted my life, because she said that that could potentially increase the amount of years he would be sentenced. And this was the first time throughout the whole process that I really felt like what I wanted, how I felt, was taken into consideration. This to me felt like a greater form of justice than all of the rest of it, because all I really wanted was to be able to express the harm that had been done to me and have a voice and enable the abuser to understand and take accountability for what had happened to me. After that, the sentencing took place and he was sentenced to 13 years in prison. I could have gone to the sentencing, but by that point I had gotten a job in a completely different area, so I wasn't able to attend. And honestly, I didn't even want to attend because that would mean I'd have to see the abuser again. However, a year ago, I found out that the sentence had been reduced to 7 years, and the only reason they gave for reducing the sentence was because it was apparently a determinate sentence, which meant that it was capable of being reduced at any time. And that was just really frustrating to me, because even though I'm a prison abolitionist, as I talked about in my last video, I don't believe in prisons. I don't believe that incarceration is a form of justice. At the same time, to me, this reduction in his sentencing had symbolic significance, because it seemed to signify to me just how little the crime of sexual violence is valued in our society, just how little our bodies, our bodily autonomy is valued. When you take into consideration the number of years people are incarcerated for robbing money or for doing drugs, it's much higher than the type of sentencing you get for inflicting sexual violence. And I think this just shows to us that we're so behind in our society in terms of how we view sexual violence, especially when you see that it's one of the least indicated, least convicted, least reported crimes that exist. Clearly, we are doing something very wrong. We are failing victims on so many levels. So overall, I would say that my whole experience was incredibly re-traumatizing. It just ended up replicating so many of the forms of abuse that I experienced as a child, with this dominating, aggressive man leering over me, manipulating me, trying to get me to acquiesce to all his needs, making me feel like nothing, making me feel like a liar. And in the same way as I had acquiesced and submitted and tried to appease and please as a child with the perpetrator, I felt like I was forced to do the same in that courtroom with the judge and with the jury and the barrister. And I also felt like it was an extreme form of violence, the whole way in which the system worked. And I talked about this more in my last video, so I won't go into it in more detail. But essentially, I don't actually believe justice was really served, because to me, the criminal justice system is not a form of justice. And when people tell me that it's such an amazing thing that I did by going to the police, it feels like they're explicitly saying that all the people that never went to the police because they didn't have have the same privileges as me or were unable to for some other reason, that they're somehow bad, pathetic and weak, that my best friend who never went to the police is bad, pathetic, weak. I hate these kind of narratives that either blame you or put you on this martyr pedestal. There was one moment where I did genuinely feel really proud of myself for going forward to the police, when the policewoman who was responsible for my case informed me that the other victims who had come forward after I had initially come forward had told her to thank me on their behalf, because they had said if I hadn't have come forward and if the policewoman hadn't directly been in contact with them, they would never have gotten any justice. And I was really proud that I was in some ways able to enable these other victims to get some semblance of what they considered justice to be. So that was a moment of great relief and gratitude for me for the whole experience, especially, like I said, since I carry a lot of guilt for what victims could have come after me. It was great to hear that I was able to give some semblance of justice for the victims that had come before me. Despite everything, I am actually really glad that I did go to the police. I am really relieved. I have a deep sense of peace and relief in my heart after that experience, despite the re-traumatization, because I feel as if a weight has been lifted off of my shoulders. I feel like I had this humongous sense of burden and shame and blame and all of that as a result of this experience, and some of that I still carry, but a lot of that has diminished because I no longer have to worry about who else this man is abusing and what abuse I could have prevented, because this man is incarcerated and he can't currently abuse anyone whilst he's in prison. That being said, that weight should never ever have been on my shoulders in the first place. So all of that is to say that yes, I'm glad that I went to the police. I'm glad that I made that decision, and if I could go back, I would make the same decision again. But that being said, I don't think it should ever have been my responsibility to be the one to come forward to end up incarcerating this man. That's a huge amount of responsibility to put on the shoulders of anyone, let alone a little girl. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, one of the hardest parts of the whole experience for me was having to tell people about the abuse I experienced who I'd otherwise never want to give this information to. And this just led to so many people saying things to me that will haunt me and that have been incredibly detrimental to my recovery process. Because when people continuously ask you things that are victim blaming, or ask you probing questions or grueling questions just to satisfy their curiosity, it then ends up re-traumatizing you. Oftentimes people end up re-victimizing you by treating you like you're forever going to be this helpless, hapless victim. My parents essentially treated the whole experience with such indifference and didn't seem to really care in any way about any of my experiences, and made the whole court process much more difficult on so many levels by providing zero support throughout the whole thing. And that has been incredibly difficult to come to terms with. And I also felt like some people sympathized with the abuser in ways that were incredibly unhelpful for me. I also had a woman tell me that I should have gone to the police earlier. If I'd gone to the police earlier, I could have saved other victims from the same abuse. I had people say the same sort of thing, not quite so directly, but that's essentially what they were saying. They couldn't understand why I had waited so long to go to the police, which then of course makes me feel even more terrible about myself, makes me blame myself even further. People love to impose this strong survivor narrative onto you, which I personally dislike. Two people told me that they had always known I was abused from the way I acted as a child and as an adult, which is the last thing that you want to hear, because you don't want to be made to feel like you act like a victim who's been abused. And other people try to tell you to find meaning in your trauma and your pain and try to impose this kind of narrative onto you, which I find frustrating because in some ways I do see some semblance of meaning in that, not in this toxic positivity way, but I do believe in a sort of yin and yang to most things, and I do think the whole experience has taught me a lot, and I feel like a lot of my empathy and compassion and my understanding of suffering and a lot of my politics and my activism and things like that have originated from these experiences. So I do feel like a lot of good has come out of it, but at the same time, you want that to come from yourself. You don't want other people to impose this sort of narrative onto you. It is frustrating that the whole court process meant that so many more people found out about what happened to me that I otherwise would never have wanted to tell about my experiences. But in some ways, it's actually been incredibly liberating. These days, I'm so open and vocal about my experiences because I feel like, why should I feel ashamed? I haven't done anything wrong. Why should I feel like I should be silenced about this or tiptoe around it to not make other people uncomfortable? I want to scream about it. I want to make people aware of just how frequently this stuff happens. That's just my approach. I'm not saying anyone else has to be more expressive about their experiences, not at all. The reason this was one of the most difficult parts for me is because these were people that I trusted or knew or cared about or loved in some way. So to have them express such damaging things to me really gets stuck in my mind, and it's hard to process that stuff and let go of it. And I'm still working to do a lot of that because most of the time, most of the things that people say to you is already things that I've been saying to myself for years. So in general, I just think that everyone needs to work on their emotional intelligence, their ability to just listen, to just validate people's experiences, to hold space for each other, to show more compassion for each other, to have more empathy. I think if we could all do that, the world would be just a fundamentally transformed place. And this isn't me preaching because I'm also trying to work on my emotional intelligence. But overall, I just really wanted to say thank you so much for listening because, as I mentioned in my last video, a really key part of what is justice for me is having a voice to be able to express the harm that has been done to me, feeling heard and listened to, and the fact that you've taken the time to watch this video to the end really means a lot to me and feels like I'm getting some semblance of justice that I wasn't able to get from the criminal justice system. So thank you so much for that. If anyone has any more questions about the court experience, I'm more than happy to answer any of them. Please leave them in the description box below. And as I mentioned, over on Patreon, I made a video about all the things that I've been learning through going to therapy for over a year, how abuse and healing from trauma is difficult and the mindfuck of dealing with all of that. So if you're interested in that, please consider supporting me on Patreon, or if you'd just like to support me on Patreon in general to help me to continue making more videos, that would also be amazing and I'd appreciate that so much. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for all of my current Patrons, and I hope you have a beautiful day. Bye!